My name is Lily Watson. I'm 28 years old, and I never thought the man who married my mother would become the person who tried to destroy my confidence completely. For years, I heard nothing but criticism, mockery, and cruel predictions about my future. Every single day felt like a battle, just to prove I deserved to exist in my own family. But here's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you an invisibility cloak that nobody sees coming until it's too late. What I'm about to share with you isn't just a story about revenge. It's about silent strategy, patience, and the sweetest justice I could have ever imagined. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You're probably wondering how someone goes from being called a failure to owning the very business that was supposed to prove they'd never amount to anything. Well, let me take you back to where it all started. Back to the moment when my stepfather, Marcus, looked me dead in the eyes and said those words that would change everything. "You're not built for success, Lily. You never will be." That moment, that exact second when he laughed at my dreams, became the spark that ignited something inside me I didn't even know existed. If you've ever been told you're not good enough by someone who was supposed to support you, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is going to show you exactly what happens when underestimated people decide to stop asking for permission to succeed. The crazy part? It only took me a few weeks from that humiliating conversation to completely flip the script on him. I'm talking about going from the family disappointment to the owner of his precious business. The same business he spent years bragging about. The same one he used as proof that he was self-made, while I was just wasting potential. What happened in those few weeks changed not just my financial situation, but my entire understanding of power, family, and what it really means to build something worth having. Stay with me because what comes next is going to blow your mind. Before Marcus came into my life when I was 15, I actually had dreams that felt possible. I wanted to study business, maybe open my own marketing agency someday, and I genuinely believed that hard work and dedication would get me there. My mom was supportive back then. She'd listen to my ideas, encourage me to take risks, and always told me I had something special inside me waiting to come out. But when she married Marcus 2 years later, everything shifted like someone had rewritten the rules of my existence overnight. Suddenly, my dreams were unrealistic. My goals were too ambitious for someone like me, and every achievement I worked toward was met with skepticism or outright dismissal. Marcus was a successful small business owner. He ran a mid-sized logistics company that handled supply chain management for local retailers and restaurants. To hear him tell it, he built everything from scratch with nothing but grit and intelligence, and he never missed an opportunity to remind everyone at family dinners, holidays, or random Tuesday nights that he was a self-made man. The problem was that his success became the measuring stick for everyone else's worth, and I constantly fell short in his eyes no matter what I did. I could bring home perfect grades, land a part-time job, or present a solid plan for my future, and he'd find some way to tear it down with a condescending smile and a comment that felt like a knife wrapped in concern. Living in that house felt like walking on eggshells made of my own shattered confidence. Every morning, I'd wake up wondering if today would be the day he'd find something new to criticize, some fresh way to remind me that I wasn't living up to whatever impossible standard he'd set. My mom, who once championed my dreams, slowly started echoing his doubts, asking if I was being realistic, suggesting I consider more practical paths, and worst of all, comparing me to Marcus's kids from his first marriage who apparently did everything right. The invisibility was suffocating because I wasn't just being ignored, I was being actively erased. My potential questioned so many times that I started questioning it myself. It was a Thursday evening in late September when everything finally came crashing down in the most humiliating way possible. We were hosting a family barbecue. Marcus loved these events because they gave him another stage to perform his success story in front of relatives, neighbors, and business associates who'd nod along like he was some kind of prophet. I had just finished my associate degree in business administration and was excited to share that I'd been accepted into a bachelor's program with a focus on entrepreneurship and marketing strategy. In my naive optimism, I actually thought this might be the moment Marcus would finally see me as someone capable, someone worth taking seriously instead of dismissing at every turn. I waited for what felt like the perfect moment. right after Marcus finished telling everyone about a new contract his company had landed, and I mentioned my acceptance into the program. The words had barely left my mouth when I saw his expression change from proud business owner to something far more sinister, amusement mixed with pity. He set down his beer, looked around at the guests with this theatrical pause like he was about to deliver the punchline to a joke, and then said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Lily, sweetheart, you're not built for success in business. You don't have the backbone, the instinct, or frankly the intelligence it takes to make it in the real world." The backyard went silent, except for the crackling of the grill and the distant sound of kids playing. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how I'd react. But Marcus wasn't done. He never was when he had an audience captive and a chance to establish his dominance. He went on to explain, in excruciating detail, why people like me waste time and money on degrees when we should be focusing on realistic goals, like administrative support or retail management. He compared me to his daughter, Jessica, who was apparently naturally gifted at business strategy, unlike me who just tried too hard without understanding the fundamentals. Every word felt like a public execution of my dreams, and the worst part wasn't even what he said. It was watching my mom stand there silently, not defending me, not challenging him, just looking down at her plate like she agreed with every humiliating word. That night, lying in bed with tears soaking my pillow, something inside me shifted from hurt to something much more powerful, cold, calculated determination. The morning after that barbecue, I woke up with a clarity I'd never experienced before in my entire life. The tears were gone, replaced by this strange calm that felt almost dangerous, like I'd crossed some invisible line between seeking approval and realizing I never needed it in the first place. I looked at myself in the mirror and made a decision that would change everything. I would stop trying to prove myself to Marcus, stop seeking validation from my mom, and instead work in complete silence until I had something so undeniable that words would become irrelevant. If you're enjoying this story and want to see how I turned invisible pain into visible power, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Trust me, the strategy I'm about to share gets even more intense from here. I started by doing something that felt counterintuitive but proved to be genius. I became exactly what Marcus expected me to be on the surface. I stopped talking about my goals, stopped sharing my achievements, and played the role of the quiet, unremarkable stepdaughter who'd finally accepted her limitations. At family dinners, I'd nod along when he talked about business, ask simple questions that made me seem interested but not ambitious, and generally faded into the background like wallpaper nobody notices until it's gone. Meanwhile, behind this carefully constructed facade, I was working harder than I'd ever worked in my life, taking extra courses, networking with professors and business professionals, and most importantly, studying Marcus's business with the intensity of someone planning a heist. The beauty of being underestimated is that people stop watching you carefully. They assume you're harmless, irrelevant, incapable of surprising them. Marcus would leave business documents around the house, take phone calls about contracts and negotiations within earshot, and even complain about challenges his company faced right in front of me like I was furniture. I absorbed everything: his client relationships, his operational weaknesses, his financial vulnerabilities, and especially his ego-driven decision-making that prioritized looking successful over actually being strategically sound. Every piece of information became a weapon I stored away for later. Every careless comment a window into how I could eventually outmaneuver him. The invisibility he forced upon me became my greatest tactical advantage, and he had absolutely no idea what was coming. While Marcus saw me as someone who'd given up on ambition, I was actually building the strongest foundation of my life, brick by brick, in complete secrecy. I enrolled in my bachelor's program but didn't just attend classes. I devoured every single piece of knowledge like my future depended on it, because honestly, it did. My focus areas were strategic management, financial analysis, and competitive intelligence, subjects that would teach me not just how to run a business, but how to identify weaknesses in existing businesses and exploit opportunities that others overlooked. Every assignment became practice for the real game I was planning. Every case study a chance to sharpen skills I'd eventually use against the man who said I'd never make it. Beyond formal education, I started building relationships that Marcus could never have imagined I was capable of forming. I attended business networking events in the city, introduced myself to entrepreneurs and investors, and positioned myself as someone hungry to learn from people who'd actually built something substantial. The fascinating thing about genuine curiosity is that successful people respond to it. They see someone asking intelligent questions without ego, and they open doors you didn't even know existed. I met a woman named Patricia who ran a business acquisition consulting firm, and she became an unofficial mentor who taught me how companies are valued, how deals are structured, and most crucially, how to identify when a business owner is more attached to their ego than their balance sheet. I also did something that felt almost like espionage, but was completely legal. I researched Marcus's company from every possible angle. I pulled public records, analyzed his client base through industry databases available at my university library, and even created financial models based on the information I could piece together from his careless conversations. What I discovered was both validating and shocking. His business, while profitable on the surface, had significant operational inefficiencies, over-reliance on a few major clients, and a complete lack of modernization in their systems and processes. He was running a 2010 business model in 2024, and his arrogance prevented him from seeing that younger, more agile competitors were slowly eating away at his market share. Every weakness I identified felt like finding another crack in the armor he thought was impenetrable, and I documented everything with the precision of someone preparing for war. Living a double life takes a toll that nobody talks about until you're living it yourself. On the outside, I maintained this perfectly calm, accepting demeanor. The stepdaughter who'd finally learned her place and stopped causing tension with unrealistic dreams. But internally, there were nights when the weight of silence felt crushing, when I'd question whether I was doing the right thing or just setting myself up for an even more spectacular failure. The hardest part wasn't the work or the planning. It was sitting at that dinner table every single night, listening to Marcus brag about deals and decisions, watching my mom smile at him with pride, and knowing that I couldn't say a single word about what I was building, because premature revelation would destroy everything. There were moments of doubt that hit me like waves I wasn't prepared for. Moments when I'd wonder if I was being obsessive, if revenge was worth the energy I was pouring into it, if maybe I should just move out and build something completely separate from this toxic dynamic. I remember one particularly brutal night when Marcus brought up my name in conversation with a business associate, laughing about how I'd finally given up on those silly business dreams and was much happier now that she's accepted reality. Hearing myself discussed like a failed experiment that had finally been corrected made my hands shake under the table, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom where I stared at my reflection and decided once again that silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. What kept me going during those darkest moments was visualizing the endgame with perfect clarity. I'd imagine the exact moment when Marcus would realize what had happened, when the smugness would drain from his face and be replaced with genuine shock. I pictured telling him, calmly and without emotion, that I now owned the business he'd used as proof of my inadequacy, not through luck or inheritance, but through strategic planning and execution that he never thought I was capable of. That vision became my anchor when doubt tried to pull me under, and every time I felt like giving up or confronting him prematurely, I'd remind myself that the sweetest victories are the ones nobody sees coming until it's far too late to stop them. Patricia Chen became the person who transformed my plans from angry fantasy into actual executable strategy. We'd met at a small business conference where she was speaking about mergers and acquisitions, and something about her directness and no-nonsense approach to business made me trust her immediately. After her presentation, I approached her with questions that were clearly more specific than casual curiosity, and she saw right through me. She knew I wasn't just some student doing research for a class assignment. Over coffee that turned into a 3-hour conversation, I told her everything: the humiliation, the silent planning, the business I was studying, and my desire to somehow turn the tables on Marcus in a way that would be both legal and devastatingly effective. What Patricia told me that day changed my entire approach and probably saved me from making critical mistakes born from emotion rather than strategy. She said something I'll never forget. "Lily, revenge in business isn't about destroying someone. It's about demonstrating competence they refuse to acknowledge. If you want to truly win, you don't burn down his business. You acquire it, improve it, and show him what it could have been with better leadership. She explained that emotional revenge feels good for a moment, but leaves you empty, while strategic success creates lasting transformation that benefits you far beyond the initial satisfaction. Before we go further into how this advice shaped everything, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button, because what Patricia taught me next is the exact framework I used to pull off something most people said was impossible. Patricia didn't just give me philosophical advice. She gave me a practical roadmap that felt almost surgical in its precision. She taught me how to monitor a business for signs of financial distress, how to identify when an owner might be receptive to selling even if they're not actively looking, and most importantly, how to structure an acquisition that benefits both parties while positioning yourself as the solution to their problems rather than an adversary. We started meeting monthly, and she'd review my research on Marcus's company, pointing out things I'd missed and helping me understand the psychology of someone like him, a man whose identity was so wrapped up in being self-made that the thought of needing help would feel like personal failure. She helped me see that my best opportunity wouldn't come from attacking him, but from being ready when his own decisions created the perfect storm. About 8 months into my silent strategy, I started noticing changes in Marcus's behavior that confirmed what my research had been suggesting. His business was facing serious challenges he wasn't admitting to anyone. The confident bragging at dinner became slightly more defensive, with comments about temporary setbacks and market corrections that he'd quickly dismiss before anyone could ask questions. He started working longer hours, coming home stressed and irritable in ways I'd never seen before, and I noticed he'd begun screening calls during family time, which was something he never did when business was genuinely thriving. Every sign pointed to a company under pressure, and I knew from Patricia's teaching that pressure creates opportunity if you're patient enough to wait for the right moment. Through my networking connections and some careful inquiry that never directly mentioned Marcus's company by name, I discovered what was really happening behind the scenes. One of his largest clients, a regional restaurant chain that represented nearly 30% of his revenue, had decided to bring their logistics operations in-house to cut costs during an economic downturn. Another major client had switched to a competitor who offered more modern technology integration and real-time tracking systems that Marcus's company simply didn't have because he'd refused to invest in upgrades. His operational costs were climbing while his revenue was shrinking, creating the exact financial squeeze that makes business owners start questioning whether it's worth continuing or if it's time to exit while they still can. The most telling sign came during a particularly tense family dinner when Marcus's business partner, David, stopped by unexpectedly. I was in the kitchen getting drinks when I overheard part of their conversation through the doorway. David was pushing for either major capital investment to modernize their systems or seriously considering offers from potential buyers who'd been circling the company. Marcus shot back with anger about not wanting to give up control or admit defeat, but I could hear the exhaustion in his voice beneath the bravado. That conversation confirmed everything I'd been preparing for. Marcus was approaching a crossroads where his ego and his business reality were about to collide. And when that collision happened, I needed to be ready with a solution he couldn't refuse even if it killed his pride. The universe has a strange way of confirming you're on the right path when you've done the groundwork properly. 3 weeks after I overheard that conversation between Marcus and David, Patricia called me with information that made my heart race in a way I'd never experienced before. Through her network, she'd heard that Marcus's company was quietly being shopped around to potential buyers. Nothing public or official, but David had reached out to a few acquisition firms to gauge interest and get preliminary valuations. The timing was absolutely perfect because I'd just secured a meeting with a group of investors who'd expressed interest in backing young entrepreneurs with solid business plans and the ability to execute strategic acquisitions in undervalued markets. I spent 72 hours straight preparing the most important pitch of my life, a comprehensive analysis of Marcus's company that demonstrated exactly why it was underperforming, what the turnaround potential was, and how I specifically was positioned to execute that turnaround better than anyone else. I included financial projections, market analysis, competitive positioning strategies, and a detailed operational improvement plan that addressed every single weakness I'd identified over months of research. The investors were three successful business people in their 50s who'd made their money in logistics and supply chain management. And they weren't looking to just throw cash at ideas. They wanted competence, preparation, and someone who understood the unglamorous work of actually running a business rather than just dreaming about it. The pitch meeting lasted 2 hours and felt like the final exam for everything I'd been learning since that humiliating barbecue. They asked brutal questions about my experience, my relationship to the current owner, whether this was personal revenge or legitimate business strategy, and how I planned to handle the inevitable family drama that would come from this acquisition. I answered every question with complete honesty. Yes, there was personal motivation, but my analysis and strategy would work regardless of who owned the company currently. I wanted to prove something to Marcus. Absolutely. But more importantly, I wanted to prove something to myself and build a foundation for long-term success that had nothing to do with him. By the end of that meeting, they agreed to back my acquisition offer with one condition. I had to handle the negotiation myself and demonstrate that I could separate emotion from business decisions when it mattered most. The day I walked into that conference room to present my acquisition offer is burned into my memory with a clarity that will never fade. Marcus was already seated when I arrived, looking tired and older than I'd ever seen him, with David beside him and their attorney reviewing documents. The moment Marcus saw me walk through that door, his expression went from confused to absolutely stunned. His mouth literally dropped open like he was seeing a ghost or witnessing something his brain couldn't process. He turned to David with this panicked look and said, "What is this? Why is Lily here?" And I watched David explain calmly that I was the potential buyer they'd been scheduled to meet, the one whose preliminary offer had been strong enough to warrant this face-to-face negotiation. If you're watching this thinking, "There's no way this gets more intense," make sure you're subscribed because what happened in that room over the next 2 hours was absolutely wild. And drop a like if you think karma is real. I sat down across from Marcus, opened my portfolio, and began presenting my offer with the same professional calm I'd practiced 100 times with Patricia. I walked through the valuation methodology, explained my financing structure backed by serious investors, and outlined my post-acquisition strategy that would address the operational weaknesses currently threatening the company's long-term viability. Every word was measured, every number justified, and I deliberately avoided any emotional language or personal references. This was business, not therapy. Marcus sat there in complete silence for the first 15 minutes, alternating between staring at me like I'd transformed into a different person and looking at the documents in front of him like they might reveal this was all some elaborate prank. When I finished my presentation, Marcus finally found his voice, and what came out was exactly what I expected. Defensive anger mixed with disbelief. He questioned my qualifications, suggested I was being manipulated by investors who were using me, and even had the audacity to say I was getting in over my head with something I didn't understand. But here's where Patricia's training proved invaluable. I didn't react emotionally to any of it. Instead, I calmly addressed each objection with data, referenced specific operational issues his company was facing, and asked pointed questions about his own plans for addressing the problems that were costing him clients and market share. David, to his credit, recognized that my offer was legitimate and well-constructed, and he started asking practical questions about transition timelines and employee retention rather than challenging my competence. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and Marcus could feel it happening in real time, even as he tried desperately to maintain control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. The negotiation reached its critical turning point when David pulled out the other offers they'd received and laid them on the table for comparison. There were 3 competing bids, 2 from established logistics companies looking to acquire and absorb Marcus's client base into their existing operations, and 1 from a private equity firm that planned to strip the business for parts and sell off the valuable contracts. My offer was different because it preserved the company as an independent entity, protected employee jobs, and actually valued the brand Marcus had built even if I planned to run it differently. The numbers were competitive, but what made my offer superior was the vision for growth rather than extraction. And David could see that clearly, even if Marcus was too emotionally compromised to admit it. Marcus's hands were shaking as he read through the comparison document, and I watched something break inside him in real time. He stood up abruptly, walked to the window overlooking the parking lot, and stood there silently for what felt like an eternity, while everyone else in the room waited. When he finally turned around, his eyes were red, and his voice was barely controlled as he said, "I built this company from nothing. I sacrificed everything to make it what it is. And now you're sitting here telling me that someone I said wasn't built for this. You're the one who's going to take it?" The vulnerability in that moment was almost uncomfortable to witness, because for the first time ever, I was seeing Marcus without his armor of arrogance and superiority. I took a deep breath and chose my words carefully, because what I said next would either close this deal or destroy it permanently. "Marcus, I'm not taking anything from you. You're choosing to sell because the business needs things you're either unable or unwilling to provide right now. My offer gives you a fair exit, protects what you built, and ensures your employees keep their jobs under leadership that understands where the industry is going." I paused and added something that surprised even me. "You were right that I wasn't built for success the way you defined it. I was built for something different, something that doesn't require putting others down to feel valuable. This isn't about proving you wrong. It's about proving myself right." The room went silent again, and I could see David nodding slightly while Marcus processed words he never expected to hear from the stepdaughter he'd spent years dismissing. After 2 more hours of detailed negotiation covering transition timelines, payment structures, and non-compete clauses, we reached an agreement that satisfied all parties involved. David was actually relieved because my plan addressed concerns about employee welfare and company legacy that the other offers completely ignored. Marcus's attorney confirmed that my financing was solid, my investors were legitimate, and the deal structure was professionally constructed with all necessary protections in place. The only thing left was the signature, that final moment when ownership would officially transfer and everything Marcus had used to define his superiority over me would become mine to steward and transform. We gathered around the conference table one last time as the attorney presented the final documents for signature. David signed first as the minority partner. Then Marcus picked up the pen with a hand that trembled slightly despite his attempt to maintain composure. He stared at that signature line for a long moment, and I genuinely didn't know if he'd go through with it or walk away, despite how much sense the deal made financially. Finally, he signed his name with the heavy finality of someone closing a chapter they never imagined would end this way. When he slid the document across the table to me, our eyes met for just a second, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his gaze. Respect mixed with something that looked almost like regret. I signed my name, Lily Watson, on the line that made me the owner of the business Marcus had built and used as proof of my inadequacy. The attorney collected the documents, shook everyone's hands, and confirmed that pending the standard closing procedures, the acquisition would be finalized within 30 days. As people started gathering their things and preparing to leave, Marcus stood frozen in place like he was processing a reality he still couldn't quite believe. I walked over to him, extended my hand for a professional handshake, and said simply, "Thank you for the opportunity. I'll take good care of what you built." He shook my hand without saying a word, and in that moment, I realized that my victory wasn't about his humiliation. It was about my transformation from someone seeking approval to someone who no longer needed it. The first family dinner after the acquisition closed was one of the most surreal experiences of my entire life. My mom had been told about the sale by Marcus but didn't fully understand that I was the buyer until I walked through the door that evening, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the confidence of someone who'd just accomplished something extraordinary. The look on her face was a mixture of shock, confusion, and something I couldn't quite read. Maybe pride, maybe fear about what this meant for her marriage, maybe disbelief that her daughter had pulled off something this significant while living under the same roof. Marcus was already at the table, staring at his plate with the hollow expression of someone still processing a reality he'd never imagined possible. I sat down at my usual spot, poured myself a glass of wine, and waited for someone to break the unbearable silence that had settled over the room like fog. My mom finally spoke, her voice uncertain and searching. "Lily, I don't understand. How did you—" When did you... Why didn't you tell us you were doing all of this? It was a fair question, and I'd spent days thinking about how to answer it honestly without turning dinner into a therapy session or revenge monologue. I explained calmly that I'd been working toward this for over a year, that I'd built relationships with investors and mentors who believed in my capabilities, and that the opportunity to acquire Marcus's company came about through legitimate business channels rather than some orchestrated plot. Marcus didn't look up from his plate during my explanation, but I could see his jaw clenching with every word I spoke. Finally, he said something that surprised me with its raw honesty. I underestimated you completely. I said things that were cruel and unfair, and you proved me wrong in the most definitive way possible. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. I don't know if you did this to hurt me or to prove something to yourself, but either way, you won. The admission hung in the air between us, and I realized that what I felt wasn't triumph or satisfaction. It was something closer to sadness that it had to happen this way, that a grown man couldn't support his stepdaughter's potential without first being forced to witness it succeed despite his obstruction. Taking ownership of the company was just the beginning. The real test was whether I could actually deliver on the transformation strategy I'd pitched to investors and promised during negotiations. My first 90 days were absolutely brutal in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, working 16-hour days to understand every operational detail, meeting with every employee to understand their concerns and expertise, and implementing the technology upgrades that Marcus had resisted for years. There were moments when I questioned whether I'd bitten off more than I could chew, whether my confidence had exceeded my actual readiness, but I'd learned from Marcus's biggest mistake. I wasn't too proud to ask for help from people who knew more than me. Patricia became an invaluable advisor during the transition, helping me navigate challenges with employees who were skeptical about working for someone so young and with clients who needed reassurance that service quality wouldn't suffer under new ownership. I brought in a logistics technology consultant to modernize our tracking systems, hired a talented operations manager who'd been underutilized in her previous role, and most importantly, I listened to the frontline employees who'd been telling Marcus for years about inefficiencies he was too proud to acknowledge. Within 6 months, we'd recovered the major client who'd left, signed 3 new accounts that our competitors had been targeting, and increased operational efficiency by 23% through better technology and process improvements. The most satisfying moment came about 8 months after acquisition, when I received a call from David, Marcus's former business partner, who'd stayed on as a consultant during the transition period. He told me that Marcus had asked about how the company was doing, and when David shared our growth numbers and client retention success, Marcus had gone quiet for a long moment before saying, "She's better at this than I ever was." That second-hand validation meant more than I expected it to because it confirmed that my success wasn't just about buying the business. It was about demonstrating competence that even Marcus's ego couldn't deny once the results were undeniable and sustainable. The first family dinner after the acquisition closed was one of the most surreal experiences of my entire life. My mom had been told about the sale by Marcus, but didn't fully understand that I was the buyer until I walked through the door that evening carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the confidence of someone who'd just accomplished something extraordinary. The look on her face was a mixture of shock, confusion, and something I couldn't quite read. Maybe pride, maybe fear about what this meant for her marriage, maybe disbelief that her daughter had pulled off something this significant while living under the same roof. Marcus was already at the table, staring at his plate with the hollow expression of someone still processing a reality he'd never imagined possible. I sat down at my usual spot, poured myself a glass of wine, and waited for someone to break the unbearable silence that had settled over the room like fog. My mom finally spoke, her voice uncertain and searching. "Lily, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us you were doing all of this?" It was a fair question, and I'd spent days thinking about how to answer it honestly without turning dinner into a therapy session or revenge monologue. I explained calmly that I'd been working toward this for over a year, that I'd built relationships with investors and mentors who believed in my capabilities, and that the opportunity to acquire Marcus's company came about through legitimate business channels rather than some orchestrated plot. Marcus didn't look up from his plate during my explanation, but I could see his jaw clenching with every word I spoke. Finally, he said something that surprised me with its raw honesty. I underestimated you completely. I said things that were cruel and unfair, and you proved me wrong in the most definitive way possible. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. I don't know if you did this to hurt me or to prove something to yourself, but either way, you won. The admission hung in the air between us, and I realized that what I felt wasn't triumph or satisfaction. It was something closer to sadness that it had to happen this way, that a grown man couldn't support his stepdaughter's potential without first being forced to witness it succeed despite his obstruction. Taking ownership of the company was just the beginning. The real test was whether I could actually deliver on the transformation strategy I'd pitched to investors and promised during negotiations. My first 90 days were absolutely brutal in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, working 16-hour days to understand every operational detail, meeting with every employee to understand their concerns and expertise, and implementing the technology upgrades that Marcus had resisted for years. There were moments when I questioned whether I'd bitten off more than I could chew, whether my confidence had exceeded my actual readiness, but I'd learned from Marcus's biggest mistake. I wasn't too proud to ask for help from people who knew more than me. Patricia became an invaluable advisor during the transition, helping me navigate challenges with employees who were skeptical about working for someone so young and with clients who needed reassurance that service quality wouldn't suffer under new ownership. I brought in a logistics technology consultant to modernize our tracking systems, hired a talented operations manager who'd been underutilized in her previous role, and most importantly, I listened to the frontline employees who'd been telling Marcus for years about inefficiencies he was too proud to acknowledge. Within 6 months, we'd recovered the major client who'd left, signed 3 new accounts that our competitors had been targeting, and increased operational efficiency by 23% through better technology and process improvements. The most satisfying moment came about 8 months after acquisition, when I received a call from David, Marcus's former business partner, who'd stayed on as a consultant during the transition period. He told me that Marcus had asked about how the company was doing, and when David shared our growth numbers and client retention success, Marcus had gone quiet for a long moment before saying, "She's better at this than I ever was." That second-hand validation meant more than I expected it to because it confirmed that my success wasn't just about buying the business. It was about demonstrating competence that even Marcus's ego couldn't deny once the results were undeniable and sustainable. As the business stabilized and started to grow under my leadership, the anger that had fueled so much of my early planning began to fade in a way I didn't expect. I thought I'd want to replay that humiliating barbecue moment over and over with a new ending where I walked in, tossed the signed acquisition papers on the table, and watched Marcus crumble. But instead, what I found myself replaying was something different. The quiet moments in my apartment late at night when I'd look over our financials, see the company thriving, and realize I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I wasn't the girl being mocked in front of family. I was the woman steering an entire organization toward a better future. And that shift in identity changed everything about how I viewed what had happened. Revenge had been the spark, but it wasn't the fuel anymore. What kept me going each day wasn't the memory of Marcus laughing at me. It was seeing employees excited about new opportunities, watching clients trust us with bigger contracts, and knowing that I'd built a life that wasn't dependent on anyone's permission. I started to understand something Patricia had hinted at from the beginning. If you stay in revenge mode too long, you end up chained to the very person you're trying to break free from. True power is being able to look at someone who hurt you and realize they no longer have any control over your emotions, your choices, or your future, because you've outgrown the need for their recognition. There was one final conversation with Marcus that really closed the emotional loop for me. We ran into each other at a local cafe about a year after the acquisition, and instead of tension, the moment felt strangely calm. He asked how the business was doing, and I gave him a straightforward update without gloating, without rubbing anything in his face. He nodded, looked me in the eyes, and said, "I was wrong about you, completely wrong. I hope you know that." And in that moment I realized I didn't need his apology, but I accepted it anyway. Not for him, but for the version of me who used to lie awake wondering if he'd ever see my worth. That version of me finally got closure, even though the woman I'd become had already moved far beyond needing it. So here I am, Lily Watson, the girl who was told she wasn't built for success and ended up buying the very business that was used as proof of her supposed failure. When I look back at everything, the humiliation, the silent strategy, the late-night studying and planning, the negotiations, and the intense responsibility of actually running a company, I don't just see revenge. I see a blueprint for what happens when you stop begging for validation and start quietly building something no one can take away from you. If this story is hitting close to home, if you've ever felt underestimated or dismissed by someone who should have believed in you, I hope you hear this clearly. Their opinion is not your destiny unless you let it be. What I learned through this entire journey is that revenge, on its own, is empty. Buying Marcus's business felt incredible in the moment, but what truly changed my life was what came after. The discipline, the growth, the leadership, the confidence that comes from backing yourself when nobody else will. The sweetest part of my revenge wasn't watching Marcus sign those papers. It was realizing months later that I no longer thought about him when I made big decisions. He went from being the voice in my head telling me I couldn't, to a distant character in my origin story who unintentionally pushed me toward becoming who I was meant to be. Before I wrap this up, if my story resonated with you, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button. There are so many more twists and real-life stories I want to share with you. Now I want to hear from you. After everything you've heard, what would you have done in my place? Would you have gone as far as buying his business? Or walked away and built something completely separate? Do you believe revenge ever truly brings peace? Or is it just a stepping stone toward healing and self-respect? Was I wrong for what I did? Or was this just karma doing its job with a little strategic help? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, about betrayal, silent comebacks, and unexpected victories, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video, where I'll share an even crazier story about how another family's black sheep turned out to be the only one who knew what they were doing. I'll see you in the next video.